welcome everyone here to this issue of the Freedom Hub's Working Group. I'm your host, Jeff Cantor, along with my co-host, Charles Froman. We are sponsored by the Freedom Hub, and we are the Disruptors Intersection for sure, where we're definitely trying to unite all the activists and entrepreneurial disruptors. We are moving forward with recording all these for our posterity. We have them on a variety of platforms. Here's a registration link, but to kind of save you a step, what we've done is we've actually created a more important site where they're listed at. I'll come back to this quick second just to point out real fast. We do have a LinkedIn group, so we'd certainly love to have you join and participate in the conversation. And as I said, we have a special site, the MPHWF. It's the acronym for the Marketplace for Health, Wealth, and Freedom. And when you get here, you'll notice there's a variety of drop downs, quite interesting, pertinent to today, though. You'll notice under the home page, it says information. Well, when you click on that tab, lo and behold, you end up over here. And let's take it to the top. This kind of gives you a rundown on the various shows that we operate throughout the week. There's 2 on Wednesdays. We're at the one at 4 today, and there'll be one later tonight about cash patience. We do have one that's pertinent to how much your wealth is important to you, and that's on Thursdays. And there's some really great ones. You can click over there and see some of the past ones as well. We also show you the guests that are forthcoming, and then also links that I showed you a moment ago. Here's where they are archived here, so you don't have to try to remember a bunch of different sites. You just come here all the time. And to give you a taste of it, if you click on BitChute as an example, here's just a sampling of what's been out there. And here on Brighteon, and you can see this one is a little more visual. You can see the magnitude of the numbers of shows we've done, and there really are some fantastic ones. Here's a great one with this gal named Laura Ebke we know something about. But there's some really very good ones in here, and that doesn't matter if they're a week old or 6 months old. They're still super current, the bulk of them. And in fact, they're so current that we've taken it one step further where we go to the continuing the conversation, because some of these people, we have such a great time with them, and what they're talking about really is more of a cause or has a reason to move forward. So you're going to want to actually come in here and connect with these people. So here's an example as one of them here. So this is a fellow. This tells you a little bit about who he was, the links to those videos, a little bit more about the person. Here's links to some of his presentation stuff, and then instances where you may want to connect to their blog or whatever would also be contained here too. And then lastly, before we get into today, we also have the freedom page where it's fighting for freedom. And this is a critical one too. Why? Because the whole top portion are all these things that are underway right now that you really do need to take, be aware of and to try to act upon. So definitely make a point of doing that. And then lastly, these are the different organizations that are out there working for us. So we really want to make sure that this is all on your radar screen for sure. So let's dig in a little bit to today though. So let's let Charles do the honors here and give us a little introduction on today's guest.
Gladly, Jeff, and welcome, Dick. It's a great topic, faith and freedom, religion and politics. You can't escape those two conversation topics, although some would discourage you from raising either at the dinner table for Thanksgiving. But as 2020 has shown us, these are strange times. And when fear kind of raises religion and other controversial issues as a safety net, and as people think about existential things, they talk about religion. And that has been a topic throughout our founding, as Dick will present tonight. He has a new book coming out, Faith and Freedom. He is a staff contributor at the Libertarian Christian Institute. And, people argue what the Bible says, given to Caesar, or that chapter from Samuel's where Yahweh warns the Israelites against replacing their so-called corrupt judges with trustworthy kings. And he can discuss that parable a little more. I met Dick, I guess, a few years ago, recruiting volunteers for Governor Gary Johnson's presidential campaign in Nebraska. I realized Dick was one of the more accomplished and connected liberty activists. Indeed, you mentioned Senator Ebke, who presented to us a month ago on licensing, barriers to entry, when Ms. Ebke was a Republican Judiciary Committee chair in the Nebraska's unicameral legislature, and then she turned Libertarian Dick was her counsel, and he's also a counsel now on a different committee, but he has a private practice for Second Amendment issues largely. And what I found researching him for this program is he was the librarian for the Mises Institute down in Alabama that broke away from, the schism with Rothbard and Cato back in 1980. They have a fantastic think tank down there with great Austrian economists. So Dick got to spend some quality years with those scholars, and that thus informs all of his, large philosophical issues and opinions. So looking forward to today's presentation, Jeff.
Very good. That is sounding very exciting. An awful lot of background you got there, Dick. So I'm keen to see how that all ties together to today. So you have the screen.
All right. So our topic today, or at least the one that I'm going to be talking at you about, is what is a God-fearing country? Now, I'll confess that's a little bit of a clickbaity type title for this, but bear with me. Really,
that's my fault.
That's okay. It's really about the intersection of libertarianism and my understanding of Christianity. And so, as Jeff and Charles mentioned, I really had my foundation in libertarian philosophy in my time at the Mises Institute. And Bob Murphy was the one who really first sold me on this proposition that libertarian thinking should lead you to believe that the state and Christianity are incompatible. And specifically, really the core of the argument that won me over was when Bob persuaded me that collateral damage in warfare is still a violation of the Sixth Commandment prohibition on murder. And so, as Randolph Bourne said, war is the health of the state, meaning that really the fear of the other, fear of attack, and the desire to have strong defenses are really what wins people over to supporting the state. And so that really struck home with me. And once I rejected state warfare, then the rest of the state wasn't far behind. So I am a libertarian for a number of different reasons, but I first became a libertarian on the basis of my Christian beliefs. So what is a God-fearing country? First off, let's talk a little bit about religious liberty. That's something that America is supposed to be really good at, right? We talk about that being part of the reason why this country was settled by the first European settlers. And of course, we like to think that we maybe haven't cornered the market on religious liberty, but are exemplars of it, right? And so there's a couple of different types of liberty that we might be describing when we say religious liberty, and I just want to kind of get this stuff out. So there's the negative liberty, right? The freedom from compulsory religion, and you don't have to be a Christian or any other type of religionist for that matter to desire that kind of liberty relating to religion. For example, avoiding church tax, which we used to have in colonies here in the Americas. Avoiding the forcible imposition of dogma. Of course, there are terrible stories from Europe's history about people being persecuted for diverging from the powers that be on a particular question of dogma. And then, of course, just the idea that there shouldn't be a religious test for civil rights, that people, that their beliefs shouldn't impact whether or not they enjoy property rights and a right to life and so on. Then there's the sort of positive liberties that we can describe that really have to do with the freedom to practice religion. And so that might include things like not having churches subject to tax, not having restraints on your ability to speak in relation to your religion or anything else, the freedom to publicly or privately assemble with others, hopefully for any reason, but certainly in this context, talking about a religious assembly. And then things like parental authority for determining a program of religious instruction for children and allowing parents the leeway to sort of play things as they see fit and as people best situated to work with that child and the person who presumably has the child's best interests at heart. That's awfully important. And certainly part of my religion is proselytizing, and proselytizing to my own children is absolutely something that I believe is incumbent upon me as a Christian believer. And there are lots of other applications of faith that can play out in daily life or in work. And of course, the unfortunate example of the cake baker being required to decorate a cake in a particular way that communicated a message that he didn't agree with might be an example, or refusing that is an example of, well, we might really say it's negative liberty, not being forced to engage in speech that violates one's own principles. So those are the sorts of different expressions of liberty that are related to this topic of religion. And that really has more to do with, if I am a religious person, I might be looking at these things and deciding whether or not I want to live someplace, right? Whether I'm going to be free. And certainly we're all told that that's the story of the Pilgrims, right? Coming to Plymouth Plantation to be able to practice their religion without external restraint on them. But then there's also the question of not just am I free to practice my religion, but is the society that I'm living in a just sort of society according to the values that I hold to? Because now I'll tell you, I'm a Baptist. I grew up with parents that went to Southern Baptist Seminary, and I'm a deacon at a Southern Baptist church right now. And in the Baptist tradition, and Baptists aren't alone in this, but in the Baptist tradition, we very strongly believe in individual conscience and the soul liberty is how I might describe it, the freedom of the individual conscience to decide matters of faith. And so conscience, of course, is informed by belief. Once we come to certain conclusions, those conclusions then help us analyze other situations and be conscientious as we gain a fuller understanding of the world and how we interpret different acts. So I have to add a little history note here, and it's, despite it being almost 400 years ago, it's something of a personal history note, and I'll explain that in a second. But there was a battle here in America that a lot of people haven't ever heard about. It's called the Battle of Severn. It happened in March of 1655, and this was both a land and naval conflict between the Puritans and the Catholics that was arguably one of the last battles of the English Civil War. And Maryland, as a colony, it was actually chartered as an absolute proprietorship. And so Cecil Calvert and his family essentially got to act almost like owners of the whole area that was subject to that charter. And that proprietorship was issued in 1632. And it wasn't too long, not even a generation later, in 1649, that a Religious Tolerance Act was passed. It was the second one ever in America, and it was passed by the Maryland Colonial Assembly. And this wasn't absolute legal freedom of conscience, but you weren't going to be executed as long as you were a Trinitarian Christian, right? You weren't subject to reprisals on the basis of your faith as long as you were a Trinitarian Christian, which at the time was very innovative because, of course, there was a great struggle between the Catholic Church and various Protestants. And so there was this battle that was literally between religious factions, and 9 Catholics were captured and sentenced to death. Now, I think 5 of them were granted reprieves, one of whom was my ancestor. And he was the Surveyor General of the colony and had been part of the Colonial Assembly that passed the Maryland Toleration Act. And he actually was a Catholic. He came over as an indentured servant to a Catholic priest and ultimately rose to the highest office for a non-nobleman to hold in that colony. And his death sentence was ultimately commuted to 1,000 pounds of tobacco. So he got off a little lighter. Okay, sorry, I'm back. Okay, so in any case, I've got a little bit of a family connection to this question of whether there ought to be religious liberty or not, and I am proud of that connection to legal toleration of other people's views. And again, this isn't quite as broad as what we libertarians would advocate for, but it was a good step in the right direction, following in the example of Rhode Island. So talking about libertarianism, which I've said that word a whole bunch of times, we ought to define it. Libertarianism is often defined in terms of a single axiom we often call the non-aggression principle, or the NAP. And the idea here is that there ought not be any initiation of force against non-aggressors. And so what Christian libertarians would say is that the NAP, or libertarianism more broadly, is the most consistent expression of Christian political thought. And indeed, that is sort of the mission statement for the Libertarian Christian Institute, where I'm a staff contributor. So I would argue, as a Christian believer and as a Christian libertarian, that the non-aggression principle is implied by the golden rule. And so I have several scripture references here. And the first two really have to do with the statement that you ought to treat others as you want to be treated, or you ought to love others as yourself. And the third one, I believe, is the more familiar statement of the golden rule. But in any case, there's this really radical idea that rights are reciprocal, and that if I want to enjoy a right, then I ought to respect that right in others. And I say this is a radical idea because, of course, if you're in a historical context where there's a warlord and he makes the rules, right? The golden rule is he who has the gold makes the rule, right? We've heard it jokingly referred to that way. If that's the context that I'm in, there isn't reciprocity in legal rights. And so I think that the statement of the golden rule moves the ball tremendously in terms of describing this legal equality that ought to exist among all people. And so there's this question here, this variable that we have to define. What is aggression, right? If I'm supposed to avoid aggression, I ought to be able to define it and know what entails aggression. And so to apply the NAP, like I say, we first have to define what rights exist so that we know that, okay, that was a violation of rights, therefore that was an aggressive act, therefore that was an injustice, right? And so I think the Bible defines justice in a way that's actually quite compatible with how most libertarians would define it. And so really there's a couple of different types of justice that the Bible addresses itself to. The first one, and I would argue from the Christian perspective, the more important type of justice, has to do with your soul and sin versus righteousness, and God's perfect justice versus man's falling short and committing acts of sin, which we define as disobedience to God and violations of God's law. But that's not the only kind of justice that the Bible talks about. We might refer to that sort of justice as morality or avoiding vice, right? Things that we ought to do, but not necessarily things we can be compelled to do. But when we're talking about other people's rights, that is something where I can be compelled, at least I ought to be able to be compelled to respect the rights of others. And if I violate somebody else's rights, that's the sort of conduct that justifies a retributive or defensive response. And so the Bible talks a lot about giving others their due, what libertarians would refer to as respecting other people's rights. And it talks about it broadly, but it also gives us some detail. So what we can learn about rights from the Bible, first of all, we know murder is wrong. Early on, we get that, right, in the story of Cain and Abel, and how, after this killing, Abel's blood is crying out from the ground. And there's this sort of way in which the world has been put in disarray, right? There's something wrong because a murder has been committed, and there are consequences that follow from it, right? Cain is banished and he's marked in some way, and he basically, we get this picture of him walking the earth, right? But he's banished, and from what little society there would have been in that period in the Bible, perhaps something approaching a death sentence, right? To be sin away from other people that you might otherwise participate in the division of labor with, right? So very serious penalty there. But we see in the Bible that kidnapping and slaveholding are wrong, at least in how we would define slavery in the modern sense. There's also a biblical slavery that is almost like giving somebody a pension if they work for you a long time, and I won't talk too much about that. But man stealing, that kind of slavery, chattel slavery, is condemned, and it's condemned as something that is a capital offense in Exodus 21:16, whether you're caught with the slave in your possession or having already sold him. We see in Exodus 21:18 that assault is wrong, striking others. We see in Proverbs 20:23 that dishonest scales or diverse weights, meaning a set of weights where two are maybe marked as being the same weight, but one's a little heavier, and that's the one that I use when a heavier weight favors me as the merchant, and I have this lighter one that's incorrectly marked that favors me in the other direction on the other side of the transaction, right? And so that idea of fraudulently acquiring other people's property, that's something that the Bible condemns as well. And it says that God condemns. And if it's commonplace in society, it has societal consequences. And those warnings are there in the Bible. And we see that in Jeremiah 22, among other places. We see that bearing false witness is wrong. And of course, most famously, we see that in the Ten Commandments. But we also see, for example, in Amos 2:6, a condemnation of abusive or false accusations in court, people accusing others of things, perhaps to acquire their property or to obtain some end through this, what we would say is an unjust means. And then we see in Deuteronomy 16 that taking bribes is wrong, and perverting justice because somebody paid you to do so, whether that's bearing false witness because you're getting paid, or if you're in the position of the person who's helping with the dispute resolution, like a judge, for example, or a mediator, arbitrator, something like that, taking a bribe in order to come to one conclusion rather than the other is the sort of thing that's condemned there in Deuteronomy. And of course, we know theft is wrong, right? Thou shalt not steal, and that's affirmed in many other places in Scripture. And so what I would suggest is that, first of all, the prohibition on theft necessarily implies the legitimacy of property rights, right? You can't accuse someone of theft absent the convention of property, because if someone doesn't have a property right in the first place, we can't say it was theirs, and thus when somebody else carries it away, it's not theft, right? Theft is carrying away the property of another person with the intent to permanently deprive them of it. And so if theft is prohibited, that logically implies that property must be legitimate and must be something that is defensible. Likewise, the prohibition on murder logically implies that there is a right to life. If it's wrong for you to take my life away, that implies, I think, that I must have some right, some defensible right to my life. And indeed, all a right is saying I can stop someone else from depriving me of that thing, right? Using a reasonable amount of force. So I think the Bible sets us up quite nicely to have all of the basic trappings of a civilized society based on these sorts of rules and the many others that are contained in the Bible. Now, there are many rules that I would argue really only applied to that covenant community in Israel, in ancient Israel, and wouldn't have any legal effect or legal bearing on people outside of that voluntary community. But I think the basic framework of what is justice, and these rules weren't only in the kingdom of Israel. Some of these are with reference to living under occupation, right? And that those rules of justice are relevant whether you are under someone else's rule or you're engaged in self-rule as a nation. So another thing that we learn in the Bible is that justice applies to everybody. And having a really fancy title, or being landed gentry, or having the coolest and best and most fashionable circle of friends, none of those things should entitle you to special standing in God's eyes. And we see, the phrase that you might have heard before is God is no respecter of persons. And so insofar as God is the author of justice, and he isn't a respecter of persons, that means justice must apply equally to everybody. That everybody must live by the same standard or is rightly held accountable to the same standard. And another thing that we see in the scripture about God's law is that it doesn't change. It's not relative to time and place. We see in Luke 16, it is easier for heaven and earth to disappear than for the least stroke of a pen to drop out of the law. So, and then of course, if we are in a situation where there are unjust laws, we see that Christians must obey God rather than men, is how it's set out in the text in Acts 5. And perhaps the most famous act of civil disobedience in the Bible was when Daniel went out on his balcony and prayed to the Hebrew God in defiance of, the official royal edict, right? And he's thrown into the lion's den and miraculously spared from death there. But that's an act of civil disobedience. I mean, he was somebody who was one of the highest ranking non-Babylonians in the court, right? Or actually at that time, I guess it was the Persians. But in any case, he was certainly subject to that royal edict, and he defied it because ultimately there was a higher king that he had to answer to. And that was honored, we see in that account in Daniel. Finally, believers have a duty to be opposed to perversions of justice, especially those in pursuit of power and wealth. And we see that in Ecclesiastes 5, 8, and 9, among other places. And so it's not just that we ought not engage in that sort of conduct, but we really ought to be salt and light and identify that sort of wrongdoing when we see it and say that it is in fact wrongdoing. It's something that ought not be occurring. And that's something that we as Christians ought to speak out about, to be salty, to use the term from the Sermon on the Mount. So finally, this passage from James, just to wrap it all up, I won't read the whole thing, but there is this very real concern that people who have greater means might try to use those means to pervert justice. And there is this passage in James warning about, look, isn't it the rich who oppress you and drag you into court? And that's not a condemnation of all rich people, but it's saying that the sorts of people who can be litigious are people who have greater means at their disposal. And sometimes they abuse that ability and drag people into spurious lawsuits and try to beat them out of money in court just because the other person can't maybe put up much of a defense. And so in James, the scripture tells us, look, if we're going to fulfill the royal law stated in scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, right? But if you show favoritism, right, if you show partiality, if you only afford rights to some people and not to others, that's the Dick Clark paraphrase there, then you sin. That's something that is rebellion against God. It's disobedience to God. And you're convicted by the law as transgressors. So it's not just that you're doing something to beat that other guy out of money, but you're committing a sin against the creator of the universe. So just to put a fine point on it, I do think that there is just a fundamental conflict between statism and justice. So Max Weber famously defined the state as the only human community which lays claim to the monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force. Now, that doesn't mean that it's actually legitimate. It just means that it's popularly perceived as legitimate, right? That the state claims that it's legitimate, and to most people sells that claim, persuades them of it, right? And so states, by definition, they initiate violence to enforce their policies on people that don't necessarily consent to them. And they initiate violence in order to collect revenue in the form of extortion, or what we call taxes, right? Extortion because there's a threat of violence if you don't pay the extortioner. So taxation, sovereign immunity from lawsuit, where the sovereign or his agent go and violate somebody's rights, and then it's hard or impossible to sue them because of their state actor identity, or things like vice enforcement. All of those entail aggressive violence against persons and property. And so to me, it's pretty clear that the state at a fundamental level is simply in conflict with justice by virtue of its very definition, how it operates, the basic tools that the state uses to try to carry out, its mission and achieve its ends, or the ends that are sought by the people participating in that enterprise. So that leaves us with the question, well, how the heck are we supposed to be governed? And since Dick Clark's talking from the Libertarian Christian Institute, how does God suggest that we ought to be governed? And so I think that we can take a look at the biblical example and get a hint at this. So if we look back in Exodus 18, we see that starting with Moses and Aaron and running all the way until the time of Samuel, civil authority in the nation of Israel, not yet the kingdom of Israel, was distributed across trusted elders who were engaged in dispute resolution activities sort of on the micro level, and there was an appeal sort of chain of command that went all the way up to the high priest. But you wouldn't start out in that sort of supreme court. You're going to have your trusted elder that helping to resolve disputes. And there's going to be an awful lot of social pressure brought to bear by family members about resolving those disputes and settling up if damages are awarded to the other party. And there's a religious component to it as well, because this person from the priestly class is going to be telling you how right and wrong are properly applied in a given situation that you're involved in as a litigant. So that rule with really no state, with God raising judges from time to time to defend against external threats, and then these trusted elders engaged in dispute resolution. Of course, there are many judges that the Bible describes as God having raised up to defend Israel against the Philistines or against other, the Amalekites, other nations who were attacking the borders of Israel and killing Israelites and trying to take them into bondage or pillage the various cities in Israel. And of course, one of these was Gideon, who we've all heard of, a great hero of the faith, described as such, not just in the Old Testament in the book of Judges, but also in the New Testament, described as a hero of the faith. And he rejected the offer of the crown. He rejected the idea in Judges 8 that he ought to rule over Israel. When his time judging Israel was concluded, he didn't believe that his family ought to be a dynasty. Because they didn't just offer him the crown, but they offered to establish a dynasty. Started with him and would continue on to his, through his house, which is a great temptation, of course, to a father to think that, boy, I could obtain an honor and wealth for my children, in perpetuity or for a very long time anyway. But he rejected that. And we see that in the very next chapter, when his son Abimelech was likewise tempted, he committed mass fratricide. He killed scores of siblings in his attempt to seize power, and he was ultimately punished by God and killed, and his house was cut off. And so we see how the scripture treats someone who's trying to seize control of a nation and become its ruler, at least in the example of Israel. And so I think that the form of governance that God prescribed for Israel was a stateless legal order that was mostly characterized by liberty. Now, we see the creation of a nation state, and in this case, a kingdom in Israel's history in 1 Samuel 8. And I think that it's fair to characterize it as a failure of faith on the part of Israel's elders, in Israel more generally, and rebellion against God that they established a king. So we see in 1 Samuel 8, the elders of Israel approach Samuel, and in verses 2 to 5, they really pose a sort of good government argument for why they need a king. They say, boy, Samuel, your sons are not like you. Give us a king to judge us. And so they're making the argument that, hey, your sons are going to be corrupt judges. And so before we're relying totally on them and you're out of the picture, Samuel, we need to shift the power and the dispute resolution function over to someone else. And we want that person to be a king. And so Samuel goes to God in prayer and recounts all of the things that the elders requested of him. And God's response is one of condemnation, effectively. He says that demanding a king is rejecting him, rejecting God, in verse 7. And then verses 9 through 18, I won't do it right now because I'd go on forever and ever if I did, but I like to hold up verses 9 to 18 next to the list of grievances in the American Declaration of Independence, because I think you'll find some commonalities. And it talks about things like property being seized and given to the king's servants, and daughters, being taken as the maidservants of the king, and sons having to run before his chariots, and all of these things that are valuable in the eyes of the Israelites basically being taken or spoiled by this king that they're demanding. And so this warning that I think is a quite effective response to a good government request for a king, and say, hey, that's not going to be good government at all, elders of Israel. And so Samuel relays that prophetic message back to the elders, and then they present their second rationale, and I think it's correct to describe it as their true rationale. And that rationale was more of a keeping up with the Joneses type argument. They say, give us a king, that we may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. So it's not just that they wanted an honest judge and they needed to pick from a different pool because Samuel's family wasn't doing a good job. They wanted a warlord. They wanted a big, tall, tough guy to be their champion on the battlefield and to scare the other nations, because fundamentally there was a lack of faith in God as the defender of Israel. And so that's why demanding a king was rejection of God, because God had told them what his plan for the promised land was and their occupation of the promised land was. And they didn't have faith in God that he would follow through on his promise. Even despite his past providential care for Israel, which is cited in this passage, Israelites didn't trust God to be their champion. And that is the betrayal. And so I think that it is correct to describe statism, at least thoroughgoing radical statism, as statolatry. And I think it is very much in opposition to Christian Orthodoxy. Now, this term statolatry isn't a neologism that I coughed up. It was actually first coined by the fascists in a favorable way to describe their own ideology. And of course, famously, we probably remember Mussolini's statement of fascism as being, all things through the state, all things for the state, nothing outside the state, something like that. That's, again, the Dick Clark paraphrase. Check my work on that. But in fact, I think this idea that the state has come to replace God in the minds of a lot of people is something that has been catching ever since the early 20th century, and maybe even before that, maybe even the 19th century, when people got this idea of scientific governance, sort of the very early, green shoots of the progressive movement, if you will. But Pope Pius XI in 1931 described statolatry as pagan worship of the state, and referenced this as a real problem, the idea of replacing God with the state as the object of worship. And Ludwig von Mises, the wonderful Austrian economist who many of us have learned a lot from as libertarians, has this great quote from his short book, Omnipotent Government, from 1944, which I recommend all of you read if you haven't. And it says, men now seem eager to vest all powers in government, that is, in the apparatus of social compulsion and coercion. They aim at totalitarianism, that is, conditions in which all human affairs are managed by government. And then he goes on to talk about this quasi-religious belief that the state will somehow make Earth into a paradise. And so I don't think it's wrong to accuse statists of really erecting this idol that Christians in particular ought to be very wary of as something that's competing for worship with God. So Christianity asserts that all authority is God's, right? Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's, all of its fullness, the world and those who dwell therein. 1 Timothy 6 includes a verse that says, God, the blessed and only ruler, the King of kings and Lord of lords. And calling him the King of kings is really rebuffing empire after empire that had used that term, going back to the Assyrians, who referred to their king as the King of Kings, the ruler of rulers. And so the Bible corrects the record and says, no, our God is the ruler of rulers, and his authority is greater than all these other authorities. And in Romans 13, which a lot of people use, I think incorrectly, to justify statism, we see an affirmation that there is no authority except that which God has established. And if God's allowing something to happen, it's within his power to have stopped it. And we do see unjust actions being allowed to go on for a while to chasten Israel or for other ends that ultimately glorify God. But that's not God causing evil to happen, but allowing it for a time. At least I think that's how the Bible presents it. But ultimately, all authority is God's. And so a lot of people will bring up the render unto Caesar passage. But of course, it says, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, render unto God that which is God's. So if you're a Roman and you believe in the quasi-deity sort of character of Caesar, you're almost redundant in stating those two axioms. But if you're a believer in Yahweh, you say, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and probably the Israelites didn't believe Caesar had rightful claim to much of anything, and then render unto God that which is God's. Well, everything is God's, as we saw from the passage in Psalms. So I think that was a trick answer to a trick question. We know from that passage that people were trying to trip Jesus up and get him to say something that could be used to condemn him legally, like starting insurrection against Caesar. And so I think he said something in that passage that was very radical, but which threaded the needle and didn't allow them to build a legal case against him. So finally, I'll just mention there's a wonderful body of work, including from folks like Frederick Bastiat, who make this argument that liberty is, in fact, submission to God, and that far from being rebellion against God, liberty is acknowledging the way God designed us to work. And so from the very last passages in Bastiat's The Law, which was first published in 1850, he says this wonderful line, for liberty is an acknowledgement of faith in God in his works. And there's this idea there, and fleshed out further in the law, that God designed us so that we can work together and cooperate. And ultimately, his system works best when we don't try to build our own bureaucratic systems on top of it, as if he hadn't already designed a system that worked. So liberty is submission to God. It's not rebellion against God. And so, that leaves us with this question that we teased with the title, what is a God-fearing country? And my answer to that is, I think it's a country where people trust God more than they fear men. I think it's a country where people respect the rights of others. And I think it's a country where liberty and property are protected by law. So that's how I will answer the teaser question. And I do have to give my little pitch here at the end. Got a great short book coming out that's going to be published by the Libertarian Christian Institute Press. I wrote this with three co-authors, Dr. Norman Horn, Doug Stewart, and Carrie Baldwin, all three wonderful Christian libertarian authors. And I've known Norman going back to our time as students at conferences at the Mises Institute. So somebody that I've talked to nearly daily for at least 15 years or so, and wonderful to get to finally collaborate on a project like this with him. But it's very much in a topical Q&A sort of format. And the idea is this is really about answering objections that Christians would raise to libertarianism and making the argument that, in fact, not only is Christianity compatible with libertarianism and libertarianism compatible with Christianity, but that Christians ought to be libertarians. So that Kindle version is available for pre-order now on Amazon. And you can get further updates on the book at faithseekingfreedom.com. So that is my very last slide, and I will throw it back to my hosts.
Very good. Thanks there, Dick. That was quite good. It's kind of humorous as you analyze it a little bit, and you did a nice job there, that, the idea of libertarianism or Christianity, it's a fairly cut and dry, commonsensical approach to most everything realistically, which is its drawback. Because you see, the state is whatever I envision it to be. And so there's the enamoringness of it, because, think of it this way, I have a right to my body. The government's hands off, blah, blah, blah. But then in the other breath, it's like, oh, but I want the government to run my health care. Well, Well, how can it be good for one thing and bad for the other? I mean, but they meld it into whatever they dream it to want to be. It's a real challenge to do what you're doing.
Well, I think it's important. And like I say, I came to this conclusion honestly, and this was my path to becoming a libertarian. And it's something that I have a lot of passion about as somebody who's a Christian believer and also a proselytizing libertarian. So
Excellent. We appreciate your efforts there. David, I see your hand is up.
Hi, Dick. You and I have never talked much about religion, mostly about Austrian economics.
yeah.
A few weeks ago, Father Joe Grabowski was on this show, and as an atheist, I asked him if non-faith-based morality is possible, if he thought it was possible. And he surprised me. He said that religion is about salvation. And if you can't figure out morality from man's nature, you got a problem. And that struck me as a good relationship to Austrian economics.
Yeah.
Would you ascribe the golden rule and its reciprocal, the non-aggression principle and the rule of law, to the dogma side of religion or the secular family values side of religion? In other words, how do you distinguish between dogma and secular policy?
So, Christians often talk about general revelation versus special revelation being like a verbatim prophecy, like the sorts of things that are committed to writing in the Bible. And then general revelation is just things that are apparent to everybody from the state of nature, right? From the nature of the universe that's observable. And so I happen to think that the operator's manual, if you will, aligns with what we can discern using reason from creation, right? From nature. And so I absolutely think that it's possible for people who are not religious to reason to the correct answers when it comes to how ought we treat others. And Roderick Long, who is an atheist, was one of my philosophy professors at Auburn University. And he's argued persuasively, and I agree with him, that it is possible to reason your way to morality. Now, with that said, I don't think that we understand the fullness of the law without the lens of Christianity. But you saw me distinguish between sort of soul liberty, right? This being set back even with the house, so to speak, right? In terms of your relationship to God. And that's very different from human justice and justice with regard to social interaction. And I think it's absolutely possible for people to reason to the correct understanding of how we ought to treat others, what other people's rights are without religion. I just would urge you not to stop there.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for the question.
Any thoughts on Father Grabowski's analysis?
Well, I'd have to go back and listen to it to do it justice, but I do think that the Bible is primarily about God's relationship to man. And so I agree with him in that sense that is the most important message of the Bible, is how to reconcile yourself with God. But perhaps I would differ with him in that I do also think, as I've stated in this presentation, that there are a lot of details about what human justice ought to look like that, if you will, is a cheat sheet or the operator's manual, as I previously said, on, hey, this is the right answer. You shouldn't use unjust weights to cheat, beat a guy out of a couple of bucks in a transaction, right? You shouldn't lie in court. So there is more flesh on the bone than just first principles that we're then left to reason from, even though we might be able to get there by reason alone. So.
Okay, thanks.
Charles, I see your hand is up.
Thanks, Jeff, and great presentation, Dick. Chicken or the egg? Liberty comes before virtue, or virtue comes before liberty. And for Father Grabowski's presentation, I used Benjamin Franklin's quote that you have to have a virtuous people before liberty. But Lord Acton said, if you want to have virtue, you got to have liberty first. Can you reconcile that great philosophical conundrum, liberty or virtue?
first off, we're on a sort of liberty continuum, right? And this is maybe I have an ulterior motive for making this point, but a lot of times I meet libertarians who talk about what we would do in a libertarian society, or we talk about Ancapistan, right, for the anarcho-capitalist, and which is sort of a hypothetical society that was governed by the principles that we generally would describe as anarcho-capitalism. Here's the thing, though. I don't have to believe that I will ever live in a rape-free world to oppose rape. I don't have to believe that I'll ever live in a murder-free world to oppose murder. And likewise, I don't have to believe that I in my lifetime will ever experience a totally stateless world in order to oppose the state. And so I think that the first lesson for libertarians, and we learned this from Austrian school economics, is methodological individualism. I just think it doesn't just apply in economics, but it also applies in our analysis of justice questions, right? And so I can be a libertarian today, even in a statist society, by not calling the cops on a non-aggressor, right? By not cheating people, by not frivolously suing people. There's all sorts of things I can that I can do to be a libertarian right now. And that's not dependent on the actions of others. Now, with that said, I absolutely think that being in a social context that generally is favorable towards liberty is very helpful in arriving at the right conclusions. Because when we live under statism, when there is so much government intervention, all of these incentives that would otherwise direct us to the right conclusion and incentivize good actions, upright actions, just actions, those incentives have been perverted. And so an awful lot of people get fooled into this mindset of entitlement and this idea that scarcity is just the invention of the evil monocle wearing capitalist, and but for capitalism we would just all be Adam and Eve frolicking naked in the Garden of Eden, and I think that's wrong. And so certainly living in a libertarian context, or a more libertarian context, I think helps people arrive at the right conclusion more readily. But it's not impossible to be in a statist context and get to the right conclusion. And I think that that's evidenced by probably all of us on this call. So is that responsive?
For sure. Thank you.
That was
Jeff?
Yes, I was going to say that was quite good. Well, it looks like we're winding down our time frame here. Let me bring up the screen here for a quick second here as a consequence. Definitely want to invite everyone to visit the website. These are the same location, just kind of the long version and the short version of getting to the same place. We'll have our video up over the weekend, so come Monday, you'll find it at those various locations. And again, remember, you're going to want to follow up and find out a little bit more about Dick's book here. So we'll have that posted as well. So Dick, thanks so much for today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.